So we've come to a very decisive point in the journey of spirit in this book, and that is, as we begin part 2, the revelation, the revealing, something that Kierkegaard has been driving towards, but has now finally revealed, and that is, what is despair? Fundamentally, despair is sin. And that should clear some things up, I think. Why do I say that? Because, well, let's look at what Kierkegaard's conception of sin is on the top of page 109. He says, sin is before God, that is, in the presence of God. Now, the before is always a spatial before, in the presence of God. Sin is before God, or with the conception of God, in despair, not wanting to be oneself, or wanting in despair to be oneself. Thus, sin is intensified weakness or intensified defiance. Sin is the heightening of despair. The emphasis is on before God, that is, in the presence of God, and with the awareness of being in the presence of God, or on there being a conception of God. What makes sin, dialectically, ethically, religiously, what lawyers would call aggravated despair, is the conception of God. Aggravated despair in the sense of aggravated assault in a crime, aggravating circumstances, or circumstances in which you do something wrong, which is textbook wrong, but the circumstances make it even worse. And it's always, I think, despair, true despair, or legitimate, authentic despair is for Kierkegaard always a choice. That is, we should always remember that, I think, that despair is ultimately a choice that we make, that is, we choose to be in despair. So it's always on us, but if we choose to be in despair when we have an awareness of God, an awareness of being in the presence of God, that makes it even worse. Just like certain crimes, they're always bad, but they're even worse depending upon the victim. So why is this revelatory, this notion that sin is despair, and how does it fit in with what came before? Well, the self, as Kierkegaard sees it, the true situation, the true condition or circumstances of the self is always being in the presence of God. That is, if we are a relation which relates to itself, and we are also a relation that is established by something else, then, as he says earlier, through relating to ourselves, we also relate to something else, that is, to God, to that which created us. So the condition of sin would seem to, that idea fits very nicely, or nicely, not the word, it fits very closely with the idea of sin, because sin is about, for Kierkegaard at least, one's relationship with God. Sin is not doing something wrong in some abstract sense. Sin is an imbalance, or an illness, or a distortion, or in some way or another a mistake in our relationship with God. So it's the situation of sin that really brings out the fundamental human condition, or the fundamental condition of the self, is that it's got to deal with the fact that God is there. And sin, in a way, is messing up how one deals with that fact. So if we then move on to page 111, chapter 1, he kind of recaps how we got here. He says, part 1 pointed consistently to a rising scale in the consciousness of the self. That is, different forms of despair are correlated with a rising consciousness of self-consciousness of the self, awareness of the self. First, there was unconsciousness of having an eternal self, that is, an unconsciousness that one had a soul, or one could be spirit, followed by knowledge of having a self, in which, however, there was something eternal, and under this latter again there proved to be successive stages. As we've gotten to a certain point where spirit becomes aware of itself, this whole line of thought must now be given a new dialectical twist. And that word dialectic comes up again, and here I would say the reason he brings up dialectics is because the truth for the self changes as it becomes more self-aware, as it becomes more aware of its true situation. And the new dialectical twist here is the self's knowledge of being in the presence of God, the self's knowledge that it is relating to God in a fundamental way. Continues, the point is this: progression in consciousness we have been concerned with up to now occurs within the category of the human self, or the self that has man as its standard of measurement. That is, more or less what he seems to be saying is that the journey of consciousness now has been a journey in a world in which the self takes the human to be its standard, and the human to be the highest thing there is, the human self. But this self takes on a new quality and specification in being the self that is directly before God. This self is no longer the merely human self, but what, hoping not to be misinterpreted, I would call the theological self, the self directly before God. That is, once one becomes aware of being in the presence of God, now faced with God, being, in this unique interaction with God, Kierkegaard is saying, now everything changes. Now God is the standard. Now God is the most real thing. And what an infinite reality this self, you and me, us, acquires by being conscious of being before God, by being a human self that has God as its standard. A herdsman who, if this is possible, is a self directly before cattle, is a very low self. Similarly, a master who is a self directly before slaves, indeed, really, he is not a self, for in both cases there is no standard of measurement. That is, he seems to be getting at something here about how we change according to what we are in relation to. If you're only in relation to cattle, you're a very low self. If you're a slave master, your situation with other human beings is so distorted that you're not even a self at all, he seems to be saying. The child, who up to then has had only its parents' standard, becomes a self through acquiring, as an adult, the state as its standard. That is, child negates the authority of the parents and now moves on to his own conscience, or her own conscience, and the law, the state being their standard. But what an infinite accent is laid upon the self when it acquires God as its standard. That is, everything changes. Once we realize that God exists, and not only in some abstract sense, but that he's right there. That's really what Kierkegaard is saying. Is that God is not some abstract principle, some thing that needs to be proved. God is here for the self that has attained this degree of self-consciousness. God is there like my hand is in front of my face. It's just an obvious reality, something undeniable, and something that has to be dealt with, like running into a brick wall or having to breathe. God is there. He says then, the standard for the self is always that directly in the face of which it is a self. So we could say that the self is dialectical in another way, in the sense that the self takes on the character of that with which it is in dialogue, that which it is interacting, that with which it is conversing. So the self is not a thing that is just sort of sitting there, or something that has a certain form, and that's it. The self changes, according to Kierkegaard, I think, in this sense of dialectics, and in this sense of dialectical, the self changes according to that which it is relating to. And if all we are relating to are other human beings, that's the standard, and we'll have a human self. But if we're relating to God, he has what he calls the theological self, and by that I think he means the self that has God as its standard, and the self whose nature and character is now determined by its relating to God.